All right, so we're going to talk about animal behavior today. This is just an introduction to it. But to me, I've always found animal behavior to be really fascinating. I've taken a lot of psychology classes, but biologists maybe look at animal behavior a little bit differently than true psychologists do, but there seems to be a lot of overlap more and more as time goes on. The field of ethology is kind of more of what we would think of as the term used for studying animal behavior from a biological perspective. It's more like observing the animal, taking notes about how they're behaving in their environment, and then trying to come up with how did that behavior evolve and how did it come about. So psychologists, again, it might depend because there's also evolutionary psychology that's kind of beginning to be formed. Maybe more interested in what they call proximate causations. How does something work? Maybe a neurobiologist or neuroscientist might be interested in how neurons work. Well, biologists tend to put more of an evolutionary spin on it. But again, ethologists are more likely to go out to a field and to study a behavior and take notes. That's how it was historically done. And then they may develop experiments as well. There's been a lot of experiments where they work with honeybees, for instance, and they may put out fake flowers with a little concoction that represents the nectar, and then look at how the bees waggle dance or how it learns. So there's all sorts of things that go on with that. But ethology also looks into the genetics behind it as well. So behaviors are very complex, and the environment's important, and how animals adapted to the environment is kind of the biological, I think, is added to the psychological field. So there's been some controversies in behavior. Some people, and you probably heard this if you took a psychology class, would think that in the beginning, people thought that maybe if you had a new baby, their brain was kind of like this chalkboard, ready just to take writing down. This is completely a blank slate, and everything was nurture. But we realize it's not just nurture either, because there's another group or camp that might argue that it was just nature. There's instincts and there's things like that. But in reality, there's a combination of the two things going on in an animal. Some animals may have more instinctive behaviors that are just obvious. Some behaviors and some animals may have more learning going on, but there's a combination of instinct and learning and then building upon that, even with us humans. For instance, a baby will naturally hear sounds that sound like human voices or consonants. Are more likely to turn their head in that direction than if it was just a horn or something. The babies have instinct, a nursing reflex. If you touch them on their face, they're going to turn in the direction, for suckling. So there's a nursing reflex. There's instinctive behaviors. And then from there, it's not just a lump of clay ready to be molded, but there's actually some direction. So cat has instinct to kind of, be a predator, right? But it still has to learn those fine skills to actually be able to catch the mouse. It's not just going to happen, right? But it's kind of already genetically and brain anatomy geared to be in that direction. So it's actually a combination of the two. And then some animals have all sorts of things that are geared towards their own particular environment. Like, dolphins and porpoises have sonar. Or some insects and animals can see different, UV lights. So they have different ways of perceiving the world than we do. But just realize it's not just nature versus nurture. That's not the right question. It's a combination of the two, and then how much is it for each particular one. So it's not really an either or proposition. So early research in animal behavior focused on those instincts, that innate behavior. So we looked at animals, and then we would study them. Maybe it'd be like looking at a goose in a nest, hatched, freshly hatched goslings. And if you walk by them before the mother goose has been there, they're already instinctively set to focus in on those first movements that are outside their nest and imprint onto them. So if you had a bunch of eggs and the goslings hatched or the chickens hatched, and you were there instead of the mother, and you moved around, and they would actually could imprint on you and then follow you around the house and around the yard. They would start looking at you as their mother. That's called imprinting, by the way. So there's this adaptation that's already instinctively ready to be learned. Just like us in language, we're instinctively ready to start learning languages. Well, some, but you couldn't go, you couldn't teach, you'd have a hard time teaching a dog languages, right? They'll learn some, but they're not going to learn all of them. They're not as prepared for human words, even though they're capable of learning more, understanding more words than we realize. But the point is their brains are adapted a little differently. Dogs are more of social creatures, so they're more instinctively going to notice your body language than a cat might. There's just differences that are instinctive, and then they learn to look at you in a different way. So there's definitely some preset paths in the nervous system. So learning is essential, can be instinctive also. That's what I'm trying to get at. Imprinting is an example of this. So ethology, which is again the study of animal behavior, and I can't even include us, but it's been focused mostly on animals in their natural conditions. And the people that really got this off the ground was Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen. Carl von Frisch is really well known for working with honeybees. He looked at the waggle dance of bees and bee learning. Bees are actually some of the better learners when it comes to insects. They have actually pretty large brains. Have a mushroom body is what they call it. Peduncle, I think, or something like that. Konrad Lorenz, he did a lot of study on imprinting. He's the guy that's going to look at, imprinting in geese and gosling eggs and stuff like that. And then I believe Nick Tinbergen focused on sign stimuli, like if there's a red dot on a fish, it could trigger aggressive behavior because, they're trying to do some guarding. And so if they have a red color on their gills or something like that, that fish will see another male that has the same red coloring and attack. Well, you can take a red dot and do the same thing, get the fish to attack it. Or he may be focused on wasp behavior. I can't quite remember now. It was one of those two things anyway. But here's examples of innate behavior that you can see in animals. Here we have a mother goose who has what they call an egg retrieval behavior that's innate. So if an egg falls out of the nest, the mother will roll it back into her nest. That's an instinctive behavior. And so the egg is the sign stimulus, is what they call that. It's what triggers the behaviors. That was the words that the ethologist came up with, a sign stimulus. The red color that causes that aggressive behavior is a sign stimulus. And then we can have what you call super sign stimuluses, where you can use even a red ball or something like that. I'll get into this in a moment. In regards to the attacking fish. Well, in the case of an egg, you could put out a big round tennis ball and it'll roll it into the nest. Once this behavior starts, they call that an innate releasing mechanism. where a fixed action pattern takes place. So the fixed action pattern will be the gosling, or excuse me, the goose rolling the egg back into the nest. It'll start rolling, taking its neck and come down. You can literally remove the egg while the behavior is happening, and the behavior will continue. So we call that a fixed action pattern. It's almost robotic once it's been triggered. Even again, if you ever have a baby, you might mess with them a little bit. If you just touch their face, they'll come over and suckle. You can put your finger in there, and they'll start suckling it. They don't care if it's a nipple or a finger. That's like almost a fixed action pattern going on. So anyway, this is a fixed action pattern. This goose is rolling this egg in. And if they have a big beach ball, they'll roll it into their nest too, if it's outside, just right outside of it. Here's what I was telling you about the super science stimulus. Again, a science stimulus doesn't have to be very specific. So here's the stickleback fish. And when it's mating season and they're trying to guard their nest, they'll respond to other sticklebacks, males that have this red coloring, or you can put some kind of fake model in there, a clay model with a little bit of red paint on it, and it'll attack it as well, even though it doesn't look like much of a fish. You can take the eye off, it'll still attack it. So the red color is what you call the science stimulus, and then the behavior of attacking, I guess you could call that a fixed action pattern. But it'll attack it just because the red color is there. So you can, like I said, this rectangle or whatever diamond, it'll attack it. So again, a science stimulus causes the behavior to come out. They're also interested in genetics and how genes may influence behavior. Now, it's not going to be just the genes itself, right? The genes are important for making proteins, and then those proteins go into helping make the brain or whatever neurotransmitters, but all those things can have an influence on behavior. But they can use Mendelian genetics and occasionally can find a gene that might be responsible for certain behaviors and certain personalities. They found, for instance, that human twins that were, separated at birth, when they find those twins, then a lot of times they have a lot of the same interests and behaviors. And so it gives suggestions that genetics is important for some of their attitudes. They might both be into taekwondo or karate or something, or whatever, or both play violin or have similar viewpoints, even though they were raised in different families. So there is some genetics involved in some behaviors, it seems like. So identical twins, separated at birth, then raised apart, developed many of the similarities in personality. While fraternal twins, which means that there's like a regular brother and sister, and if they were born from the same womb, had personalities that'd be like any other two brothers and sisters. So again, this is just providing evidence that genes are important for behaviors. It says in 1996, the FOSB gene was discovered in mice, and it seems to determine whether female mice will nurture their young. So here's a normal mother. She has a normal FOSB gene. And so she's a good mother and feeds her young. However, this mother here has mutants, which means that FOSB gene may have some nucleotides that are not supposed to be there, so the protein isn't made properly. So maybe she doesn't get quite the same chemical, hormonal, whatever. And so she ends up being a neglectful mother, and here are the babies just laying around. So again, she was homozygous for a mutant FOSB gene. So apparently genes can have an importance on behavior. There's also learning that goes on, and there's different styles of learning. Learning is basically when an animal modifies its behavior after being exposed to whatever situation happens to be, like a mouse learning to better capture a cat, better learning how to capture a mouse. That's learning. It didn't, first it kind of just runs around trying to figure out what's going on, and then the mouse gets away, and then eventually it kind of learns a little bit better how to handle its claws or whatever, or bite behind the neck or whatever cats do. So that's a learning. So there's different types. There's non-associative learning, where there's no requirement for an association between two stimuli or between stimulus and a response. I'll see if I can come up with an example in a second. Sensatiation, repeating a stimulus produces a greater response, and habituation, a decrease in a response to a repeated stimuli. So if you were talking about sensitization, I'm just trying to think of a quick example on my head. If you're getting tapped by your little brother, you could either habituate to it and just ignore it, or you're going to punch them back, right? That's sensitization. So it just depends on it. But and then non-associative is when something randomly happens in the environment and you respond to it. And I think this could be related to the ringing of the bell and associating food, like in the case of classical conditioning. But I might need to double check that, or maybe I don't. I might double check on that. Maybe I'm thinking of associative learning. So associative learning is the association between two stimuli or between stimulus and a response. The behavior is conditioned. So the good example of this is classical conditioning. This one I'm sure everybody already knows, right? You guys could probably just tell me the whole story, right? Everybody knows this, right, Abby? You do? Are you familiar with it also? Well, in Russia, Pavlov was a scientist who had a bunch of dogs, and he would have like a tube or something that would provide meat juice or food to the dog, and then he would ring a bell. So he would give the food and ring the bell at the same time. And it got to the point where the dog associated the bell sound to the food. So when the food wasn't present and he still rang the bell, the dog would start drooling and all the things you would expect. I don't know if he was measuring drool or whatever, but basically the bell sound was enough to trigger the desire to eat. So this kind of goes back to even me sitting here talking about food to you. You associate the word food with food, right? So you may even start to feel a little hungry now that I mentioned it to you. If you haven't eaten dinner, do you feel a little hungrier? Is your mouth a little wetter? If I talk about pizza or whatever you like to eat, that's kind of a conditioning too. So it's kind of like classical conditioning. But again, the bell had nothing to do with the food, but because they were associated with each other, it became what they call classical conditioning. Now, there's another thing called operant conditioning. This is more of a trial and error learning. And again, a lot of this was done by psychologists like Skinner, B.F. Skinner. So what would happen is you would have a box. You might have a mouse running around and there's just different little levers and things. If a mouse pulled the right lever, it got a food reward. So quickly the mouse learned to keep hitting that lever. That's operant conditioning. Before, the mouse had no idea that lever was important, but when he touched it, from then on, he increased that rate of behavior. Or if it shocked him, what do you think happened? Then he learned to avoid it. So that's again operant conditioning. So that's trial and error learning, where you get rewarded or you get punished. I have to go back and look at that. Oh, I guess these were examples of the non-associative learning. Let's go to the next one, imprinting. So imprinting, this work was done by Konrad Lorenz. So he was one of the founders of ethology, where there's some learning that's ready to happen literally right after birth. In this case, these goslings didn't have their mother goose around. So Konrad Lorenz was standing outside of the nest when they hatched. They imprinted on him and then followed him around as if that was the mother goose. The funny thing is sometimes it goes to the point where they're actually look at this human as part of their species. I don't know if they go as far as wanting to mate with it, but there's all sorts of weird things like that happens because they start to imprint on it. And if you get a kitten young enough, I've noticed my kitten, that's now a cat, I was around it a lot when it was a kitten, and now it's still really attached to me. So that kind of things happen. So it says birds will follow the first object that they see after hatching. Now that's an important point, the following. If they don't see something outside their nest, and if they don't actively walk, the actual movement of walking towards, in this case, a human, triggered that learning. If they just were forced to stay in the nest, somehow caged them right in it so they couldn't move, that imprinting would be much lessened, much weaker. It's the actual movement that seems to be important as part of that learning process. Now, some animals learn things based on what they're kind of predetermined to focus on, instinctively focus on. We call this learning preparedness. Again, this shows that learning has an instinctive readiness that is at least somewhat linked to genes. And so, like, for example, some birds learn to associate food with colors, but not sounds. So pigeons seem to really focus on colors, but not sounds. So that's kind of it. That's what they're biologically ready to do. And if you think about pigeons, aren't really known for, they're not listening for predator or prey, right? They're not an owl listening for a mouse. So they're probably much more focused on sight for their food. So maybe that's an example of the preparedness for that. So understanding the animal's ecology is helpful to understanding how the animals are capable of learning. You can't really teach them something that's totally outside of their realm of instinct and ecology. It's much harder. But if you build up on a behavior like teaching a dog to catch a ball, right? Fetch a ball or follow a blood trail. They're instinctively ready to do that. But teaching a dog to cook your bacon and eggs, they're not, even if they had hands, they were not ready to do that. Does that make sense? That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. We've made it a little bit outside that. Let's see. Apparently some animals are very capable of learning, like the Clark's nutcracker apparently has an extraordinary spatial memory because it has a rather large hippocampus. The hippocampus seems to be important for mapping. Even like taxi drivers apparently have bigger hippocampuses in big cities before GPS and all that stuff. So they can memorize big city roads. Before we could just do this. Taxi drivers actually had to know where they were going. So they had apparently at one time they were known for having pretty big hippocampuses. Birds are prepared to learn, like we're prepared to learn languages. Birds are prepared to learn their songs. So if you have birds that never got to hear the proper song, they're not going to quite sing it correctly. They're going to sing, but their sounds aren't going to be the exact song. So they're really ready instinctively to learn the proper song. So they have to hear the adults sing the proper song, the mating songs or whatever they're going to learn. And then they'll modify their songs to be more accurate. Like human babies, they're more ready to hear consonants. It's very much easier to learn, supposedly it's much easier to learn languages when they're young. But if you kept a baby from hearing any consonants and sounds, they get to a point where they might not be able to learn. You got to do things during that critical time periods, or learning could be really hampered. I mean, imagine if you were raised in a absolutely abusive situation where you could never leave your room, could never meet with anybody, how socially awkward, or maybe not even be able to speak. So again, animals, and that includes humans, are instinctively ready to learn things. Sparrows are ready to learn their song. They may be able to get close to it. They're somewhat instinctively able to do their song, but they still need that fine tuning of learning from their adult sparrows that are singing it near them. And that's what's shown in this picture here. A central question in animal behavior. I don't know if I'm ready to upgrade this meeting. We're in 10 minutes. Oh no. I don't know if I need to do that yet. A central question in animal behavior is whether human animals show cognitive behavior. Do they process information and respond in a manner that suggests thinking? So the question is, do you think your dog has cognitive behavior? So that's a central question that people are struggling with a little bit. Do you think your dog, your cat, a chimpanzee, you are really cognitive? Some examples that provide evidence of conscious planning is Japanese macaques can separate grain from sand. Chimpanzees use twigs to probe entrances to termite nests, and sea otters bash clamps against rocks to break them open. I don't know that is, but is that enough to say something's conscious? I'm not real sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a 5-minute break and see if I can, well, okay, I guess I can talk for 8 more minutes, and then I'm going to have you have a break, and I'm going to go fix my Zoom link. But we got about 8 minutes, it seems like. And then after that, I'll fix the Zoom link. Some animals can do some problem solving. For instance, ravens have figured out how to pull this piece of meat up. So that's problem solving. Here they put a piece of meat on a string, and then the raven learns to grab the string, pull it up and hold it, grab the string, pull it up and hold it, and bring it up and eat it. The chimpanzees have learned to line up boxes so they can reach up and get a banana or whatever. Chimpanzees also learn how to use sticks for probing for termites. And there's even evidence that chimpanzees make little sticks for spears to spear little monkeys and eat them. And there's even little tribes that live in little caves. It just depends on what tribe you're talking about. But a lot of that is cultural learning in that group. So like if you took a chimpanzee that didn't have a lot of termites around them, they wouldn't just start doing that. They have to learn it. Or washing, so all those kind of things are things that take place. Behavioral ecology is the study of animal behavior that can be divided into the study of its development, a study of physiological basis, and a study of function. So obviously you can see how development's important, right? You think about all the different stages of an animal going through it when they're learning something. It also tends to focus on natural selection. How does a behavior evolve in a group of animals? Does that behavior increase its survival or its fitness? So these are all things, again, biologists tend to use when they're studying behavior. And I do think it's starting to have an influence on psychology as a field as well. So they try to figure out whether or not the behavior is adaptive and whether or not it confers an evolutionary advantage. So here's an example of some predator behaviors that reduce predation. Eggshell removal by gulls reduces predation by crows. So after the eggs hatch, they get rid of the eggs and try to get them away from their nest, as to help prevent the being attractive to gulls looking for hatchlings. Because crows can pick up and see the shells and think, oh, there's something to eat here, and maybe try to attack the nest. Nest cleaning and picking off ticks from your body. Those are all examples of behaviors that increase, the health of the animals. If they pick their ticks off each other, and grooming, that's a behavior that increases. There's also going to be behaviors that help acquire a mate. Maybe the proper dance. That's a learned behavior, or mate guarding. So those are all examples of behaviors. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll start up again at 4:45. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, I'm going to see what I can do about this program. All right, so I'm going to